Again, welcome everyone. 4 days from today begins the new year 2025 on our modern Gregorian calendars. Yeah, the year 2024 is about to come to an end. There are many traditions associated with the beginning of New Year. Traditions such as parties on New Year's Eve, kissing at midnight as we transition to the new year, eating black-eyed peas and pork on New Year's Day. And of course, there are other traditions as well. But where do these traditions originate? Does it matter where they came from? And do these traditions honor the true God? I believe we should always know why we do what we do. Today, we'll take a look at some of these New Year's traditions. But before we do, does it seem a bit odd that we begin our year in the wintertime when really nothing's going on? That wouldn't seem to make any sense. The first day on most calendars usually marks an important event of some kind. For example, around 3100 BC, that was a long time ago, the Egyptians noticed that the bright star Sirius rose next to the sun right at dawn at the same time every year. That would be around July 3rd through mid-August. This just happened to be the hottest time of the year, much like ours here. But the Egyptians came to believe that Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, combined its heat with the heat of the sun. And that's what made it so hot at that time of year. And yes, I am serious, pun intended. Of course, Sirius is 8.6 light years away, or 50.6 trillion miles from the Earth. Its heat has no effect on us. That didn't stop the ancient Egyptians from associating Sirius with the hot weather at that time of the year. There's something else going on at that time of the year, too. The Egyptians depended on the annual flooding of the Nile each year for their crops that would follow. Now, this occurs about the same time as the star Sirius appears near the sun. But anyway, they began their calendar, their new year, on what we would call August 15th today. The Egyptians began a 2-week celebration beginning on August 15th called Wafa el Nile, which means fidelity of the Nile. Now get this. The ancient Egyptians believed that their god Osiris had been killed by Set. I would mention that many believe that Set was actually Seth, one of the sons of Noah. But let's go ahead here. They believed that the Nile flooded every year because the goddess Isis cried for her husband, Osiris, who'd been killed by Set. They believed that the tears of Isis not only provided them with the water they needed for their crops each year, but one day in the future, those tears would somehow restore the dead body of Osiris back to life. Well, anyway, they began to observe Wafa el Nile for 2 weeks every year, beginning on August 15th, and they still do that to this day. I wonder myself if those celebrating Wafa el Nile today really believe that the tears of the goddess Isis are what causes the annual flooding of the Nile, and that their tears will really bring back or resurrect the dead Osiris. Or if they just maybe continue to blindly follow others, not really knowing why they're celebrating Wafa el Nile for 2 weeks. Anyway, the ancient Egyptian calendar had its year begin on what we call August 15th to commemorate the annual flooding of the Nile that brought them food out of what otherwise might have been a desert. And of course, in the hope it will one day bring their god Osiris back to life. Now, if we had to decide when our new year would begin, what day would we choose? We got to start all over again. What day would we choose? Would we make the first day of our new calendar begin on August 15th to celebrate the appearance of the star Sirius, heralding the flooding of the Nile? Well, probably not. How about some other ideas? When would be a good time to begin our annual calendar if we were starting from scratch? Well, in the past, most people grew crops and raised livestock. Most of the people were farmers of some kind. It was mainly an agrarian society. I grew up on a farm myself. Farmers begin their growing season in the spring when warmer temperatures arrive. I'm talking about the northern hemisphere here, by the way, but at that time there's also more daylight. Spring showers were good for the newly planted crops. This would seem to be a logical time to begin a new year. at the beginning of a new growing season. So we might begin our calendars at the beginning of spring. And that would coincidentally, or actually not coincidentally, it would coincide roughly with the spring equinox. So our growing season would begin around the time of the vernal equinox. That takes place on our calendars today around March 20 or 21st. Our modern calendars don't begin with the growing season in the Northern Hemisphere. Not today, but at one time they may have. Many ancient calendars had their first day of the year begin on the vernal equinox, or perhaps on a new or full moon close to the equinox. Even today, the calendars used in Iran and Afghanistan begin their new year on the vernal equinox. Per second, what about God's calendar? God gave us a calendar so we would know when to observe his appointed times, or his holy days. Let's turn to Leviticus, if you would. That's Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4. That's Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4. And we'll find that God's calendar, like many of the ancient calendars, is based on the growing season beginning in the spring. It certainly makes sense for the Israelites to begin the new year when they begin planting their crops for the new growing season. But when does that first month on the year begin on God's calendar? Well, again, Leviticus 23, verse 4. Here it talks about the feast. These are the feast, or the appointed times, of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened breads unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So we see in verse 5 here that these, the 14th day and the 15th day, beginning the Feast of Unleavened Bread, occur in the first month. That's per verse 5. So now, Exodus 34. If you would, Exodus 34, verse 18. Exodus 34, verse 18. So we know that the Feast of Unleavened Bread occurs in the first month, the beginning of God's year, but when does that first month of the year occur? That's the next question. When does that first year occur? Again, that's Exodus 34, verse 18. Now here's going to speak about the Feast of Unleavened Bread again. We just talked about that. So Exodus 34, 18. The Feast of Unleavened Bread shall you keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you in the time of the month Abib. For in the month Abib you came out of Egypt. So we see that we're to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the month of Abib. And we know that this is to be the first month of the year. We saw that already. The word Abib means the greening of the grain. And why is that important? Well, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first grain bundle or sheaf from the spring harvest, try that again. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first grain bundle or sheaf from the spring barley harvest was to be waved before God. Now, if the first month of the year came way too early, the grain wouldn't be ripe. And about a month later, if it would normally ripe, the barley grain would be a bit too ripe and begin to fall over. So the barley had to be harvested in a fairly narrow window of time, and that time roughly corresponds to the beginning of spring. And this is when God's new year would begin. In the spring, at the beginning of the growing season. There's a lot more to God's calendar, of course. I just wanted to point out that it begins in the spring. Of course, we know God's annual holy days are also based on the growing season in Israel. This is an analog to God's children growing to become mature in the faith until our harvest time comes, at the return of Jesus Christ in the last day, when we'll be brought into God's great kingdom. But we'll talk about that later. Now, back to the calendar we use here in the United States, and is also used by most of the world today. Most today use the Gregorian calendar. This was a revision of the earlier Julian calendar in an attempt to improve its accuracy, and it did. But the Julian calendar itself was based on an earlier Roman calendar that was alleged to have been based on even earlier calendars. They go back a long way. Now, originally, the first day on the Roman calendars actually made sense. Similar to God's calendar and most all the other calendars that were in use at the time, the first day of the year began on the spring equinox when the growing season began. At that time, January and February were not part of the original calendar. In fact, in the original calendar, there were only 10 months in the year. Now, after those 10 months, well, the winter really didn't have its own months. They just waited through the winter until spring arrived again, and then they began their next year. Now, the first day of the year, March 1st at that time, occurred on the spring equinox. Then, the second Roman king, Numa Pompilius, added 2 months to the calendar at the end of the year. What did he name these 2 additional months? January and February. Now, the month of February was named for the Roman festival of Februalia. We'll talk more about that festival when we get to the month of February. But I would like to quote from the website, learnreligions.com, the Roman Februalia festival, quote, "The festival known as Februalia was held near the end of the Roman calendar year, and to understand how the holiday changed over time, it helps a bit to know the calendar's history. Originally, the Roman year had only 10 months. They counted out 10 months between March and December, and basically disregarded the dead months of January and February," end quote. Now, with only 10 months in the original year, Sept means 7, so September was the 7th month of the year. Oct is a prefix meaning 8. So October was the 8th month of the year. And Nov, beginning there, means 9. November was the 10th month of the year. I'm sorry. Thank you. Let me try that again. Sorry about that. Okay, I get it right. Nov means 9, and November was the 9th month of the year. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm giving you the answer to this question I was going to ask. So December, starting with DEC, Dec represents 10, right? Think of a decade. So December represented the 10th month of the year. We'll get it right. But the point is, originally the months of January and February were not in the calendar. And September, October, November, December made sense as to the number of the months they were. But back to the article before I get in trouble here. Later, the Etruscans came along and added these 2 months back to the equation. In fact, they planned to make January the first month, but the expulsion of the Etruscan dynasty prevented this from happening, and so March 1st was considered the first day of the year. February was dedicated to Februus, a god not unlike Dis or Pluto, because it was the month in which Rome was purified by making offerings and sacrifices to the gods of the dead. We know eventually January did become the first day of the year, and March then became the 3rd month of the year. From Botanica.com, quote, "We can partly thank the Roman king Numa Pompilius. According to tradition, during his reign, Numa revised the Roman Republican calendar so that January replaced March as the first month. It was a fitting choice, since January was named after Janus, the Roman god of all beginnings. March celebrated Mars, the god of war. However, there is evidence that January 1st was not made the official start of the Roman year until 153 BCE. Now, of course, if you think about it, when January and February became the first 2 months of the year, September, October, November, December, formerly the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th month of the year, became the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months of the year, respectively. At this point, their names no longer made any sense, at least not in a numerical sense. I always wondered how those numerical names of the month got messed up, and now we know. Now, due to the drifting of the earlier inaccurate calendars, the spring equinox had drifted away from March 1st and became much closer to the end of March. Now, for the new Gregorian calendar, 11 days were removed from the Julian calendar to try to correct the errors, but it still left the equinox occurring around the 21st of March, still a ways off. But after January and February were added to the existing calendar, eventually January 1st became the first day of the new year. Okay, so what's special about that? Well, I know some will tell us that New Year's Day represents the day that Jesus Christ was circumcised, coming on the 8th day of his life as a human being. Now think about that. If he was born on December the 25th, the 8th day would be January 1st. But of course there's a problem, because we know that Jesus was not born on December 25th, or even any day close to the 25th of December. So January 1st really has no real significance about anything, at least not as far as I can tell. If you know of anything, please let me know. So as far as I'm concerned, the bottom line here is that the first day of the year, January 1st, signifies no single event, no growing season, or anything really. But despite having no relation to anything, New Year's Day and New Year's Eve do have traditions that are observed by many today. So, what are the origins of these traditions? Are they biblical? Or could they be associated with the ways the heathen served their gods? Let's take a look. What about the ball drop in Times Square every year at midnight as we transition to the new year? Let's read about that. From the website bhg.com, Holidays, New Year's Traditions, History of the Ball Drop, quote, the tradition of using balls to tell time has been around for centuries, dating back to the early 1800s. The first documented time ball was on top of the England's Royal Observatory at Greenwich, where it would drop at 1 p.m. each afternoon as a way to let nearby ships and boats know what time it was. This was before watches or cell phones, so the ball dropping was the primary way to tell time. So for the big New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square, a time ball was a natural way to symbolize one period ending and another beginning. The very first Times Square New Year's Eve celebration took place on December 31, 1904. But there was no ball drop that year. The event was organized by Adolph Oakes, the owner of the New York Times. The newspaper had just opened its headquarters in Times Square, and Oakes wanted a memorable way to ring in the new year and celebrate the newspaper's milestones. That year, 200,000 people gathered in the streets of New York City to celebrate. Each year after the 1904 event, Oakes organized bigger and more elaborate New Year's Eve parties in Times Square. In December of 1907, he commissioned a large New Year's Eve ball that would be lowered as the crowd counted down to midnight. The ball was made of iron and wood and weighed over 700 pounds. The official Waterford Crystal Times Square New Year's Eve ball that's used today is decorated with modern LED lighting. The ball measures 6 feet across and weighs more than 11,000 pounds. The computerized lighting technology can display more than 16,000 colors and patterns, which is why the ball has a different display each year. End quote. Well, many today observe the changing of one year to another on our modern Gregorian calendar, whether they watch a ball drop in Times Square or maybe just watch a clock to observe the beginning of the new year. So this tradition might seem to be harmless enough, and we'll come back to this later. However, and I'm sure you knew this was coming, there are some things about the New Year observances that true Christians should absolutely avoid. Let me tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago, several years ago actually. I happened to be having dinner with my family. It just happened to be a New Year's Day, and we'd invited a friend of the family over to have dinner with us. No big deal. Well, they brought a dish to share. Nice of them. What did they bring? They brought a dish of black-eyed peas and pork. Now, our guest stated that eating this dish containing the black-eyed peas and pork on January 1st would bring us good luck for the rest of the year. What do we think about that? Does that sound like something God would consider as a good idea, maybe? Now, this person, identifying as a Christian, by the way, was suggesting that the way to peace and favor in the coming year was to eat this particular dish of black-eyed peas and pork, to be specific. And it needed to be done on the very first day of the man-defined year, January 1st. So do we believe that black-eyed peas and pork have the power to grant us good fortune, particularly if we eat them on the first day of the year? we really want to be blessed in the coming year, what should true Christians do? I think prayer to the true God would likely help, especially combined with keeping his commandments to the best of our abilities. And that's what we're instructed to do if we seek God's blessings. So why would anyone even suggest something like this? I mean, where did they get the idea? We're going to find out. Hang in there with me. Let's move ahead here a little bit. From the website, thisgrabsportion.com, from an article titled The Pagan Origin of New Year's Day, quote, humans have celebrated the start of the new year for thousands of years. In most cases, these celebrations were linked to agricultural and astronomical events. We talked about that earlier. The earliest recorded New Year's Day celebration was 4,000 years ago in Babylon. It took place during the first new moon following the vernal equinox. Yes, the new year actually begins in spring, not winter. This was so because there was an equal amount of sunlight and darkness heralding the start of a new year and representing the rebirth of the natural world. To mark the new year, the Babylonians created a festival called Akatu. It derives from the Sumerian word for barley. That's interesting. The festival lasted 11 days, and a different ritual was conducted on each day. Statues of the gods were paraded throughout the streets as rites were conducted to symbolize their victory over the forces of chaos. They believed that through these rites, the world was cleansed and recreated by the gods in preparation for the new year and the return of spring. The principal god celebrated during this festival was Marduk, a Babylonian sky god. Marduk was celebrated for his mythical victory over the evil sea goddess Tiamat. During Akatu, the new king was crowned, or the current monarch's rule extended. The king practiced a public ritual of humiliation during which he was brought before the statue of Marduk. He was stripped of his robes, slapped, and dragged by the ears in the hope of making him cry. If he cried, this was seen as a sign that Marduk was satisfied and extended his rule. So it's a good thing for him to cry. I think I would cry if it happened to me. Anyway, the modern celebration of New Year's Day originates with the Roman celebration of the god Janus. The god's full name is Janus Bifrons, meaning the god who looked both ways. It explains why Janus has two faces, as a representation of his ability to look back into the past and forward into the future. This idea was tied to the concept of transition from one year to the next, from one vision to the next, and growth into adulthood. He was also worshipped at the beginning of harvest season, planting times, marriages, births, deaths, etc. Romans celebrated January 1st by offering sacrifices to Janus in hopes of gaining good fortune in the new year. I think we're going to see that many of our New Year's traditions are based on the worship of false gods that would allegedly bless us in the coming year, if they were really true gods. But let's continue. Still quoting. They decorated their homes with laurel branches and spent the day partying. It was common for friends and family to exchange well wishes in gift figs and honey. Gifts were exchanged because they believed that the beginning of anything was an omen for the whole. Kissing, at the moment of transition into the next year, is rooted in pagan sexual practice and superstition. End quote. I kind of had a feeling that would be the case. We know that many of the pagan practices were all about fertility and sexuality, so that comes as no surprise to me. Let's continue on. Sorry, I'm almost done. Watch night services were conducted to watch out for evil spirits who were believed to roam the earth during those times. Hence comes a tradition of staying up to ring in the new year. More on ringing in the new year shortly. But continuing now, here we go. This is what I've been waiting for. Still quoting from the article. Eating pork and black-eyed peas on New Year's Day originates from homage to Janus. His mythological wife, Karna, was honored during her festival with a dish of fava beans and pork bacon. The peas or beans symbolize rebirth, and pork or swine was the preferred sacrificial meat to the gods. Notice the contrast there. So there, friends, is where the black-eyed peas and pork came from the worship of false gods. Yet we had a person claiming to be a Christian telling us to eat the black-eyed peas and the pork so that we would have good luck in the coming year. In other words, we should eat the preferred sacrificial meal of the false gods to gain their favor. Let's finish the article. In an attempt to Christianize January celebrations, the Catholic Church created the Feast of the Circumcision. Supposedly, this day venerated Christ's 8th day of life following Jewish tradition. End quote. Because that was the day he'd be circumcised. But of course, as we said, Christ wasn't born on December 25th, or nowhere near that. It really seems like the Catholic Church rarely ever condemns worshiping the one true God in the manner of the heathen, something our Bibles instruct us never to do. Rather, they tend to Christianize the worship of false gods. They adopt the practices of the heathen and then claim that they honor the one true God. But can we take something God considers detestable, an abomination to him, and somehow incorporate that into our worship of him? Well, we can find the answer to that question in Job 14, verse 4. I'll just read that to you, but Job 14, verse 4 tells us, asks the question actually, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Who can do that? The answer in Job? Not one. Not one. Our Bibles tell us that we cannot turn something unclean into something clean. We can't take the ways of the heathen, the ways they worship their gods, something that God detests, and then use them to worship the one true God and expect him to be happy about it. That doesn't work. But what about the phrase ringing in the new year? Where did that originate and what does it mean? From the website mentalfloss.com, in an article titled, Why Do We Ring in the New Year? Quote, communities used to bid adieu to the old year and welcome the new one by ringing bells, often in churches. The tradition may have grown out of other occasions where bells marked an end, passing bells tolled when someone died, or celebrated a beginning like wedding bells. Wall Street's Trinity Church rang in the new year with a veritable concert put on by the church's official bell ringer, James E. Olive. As the New York Herald reported in 1860, there floated from the high church tower the stirring music of 8 bells, chiming in changes and making the air redolent with harmony. According to Trinity's church archives, the earliest mention of the tradition is from the minutes of an 1801 meeting where parishioners allotted £8 to the persons who rang the bells on New Year's Day. It might have been going on long before that, considering the church got its first bell back in 1698. In short, ringing bells was once a central part of the holiday. The fact that it's faded from memory and ring in the new year makes little sense, if you don't know the phrase history, that is, may help explain why so many people now say, bring in the new year instead. All right, what about New Year's resolutions? Well, from an article at history.com titled, The History of New Year's Resolutions. Quote, The ancient Babylonians are said to have been the first people to make New Year's resolutions some 4,000 years ago. They were also the first to hold recorded celebrations in honor of the new year. They also made promises to the gods to pay their debts and return any objects they had borrowed. These promises could be considered the forerunners of our New Year's resolutions. If the Babylonians kept to their word, their pagan gods would bestow favor on them for the coming year. If not, they would fall out of the gods' favor, a place no one wanted to be. End quote. Yet again, we see people trying to gain favor by appeasing false gods, rather than worshiping the one true one. Turn with me, if you would, to 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21. That should probably be memorized. We use it all the time. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. We should never just blindly follow any man, any denomination, or any tradition. What should we do? What does the Apostle Paul say? Again, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. He tells us, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. And so we need to always prove what we're being told. We need to know why we're participating in our traditions. Many of the traditions that we were taught as children, well, they actually come from the worship of false gods. And even if we don't believe that we're holding rituals to the false gods, the very next verse, verse 22, tells us to abstain from all appearance of evil. Going on here. Fireworks and other types of noisemakers are common on New Year's Eve, and this tradition is said to originate in China in the 7th century AD. The fireworks are meant to scare off evil spirits, but they're also known to bring prosperity and good luck, or at least they're known as that. Here's one for you. In Denmark, people stand on chairs and leap into January at midnight. Now, that's supposedly going to bring them good luck and banish bad spirits. I'm not going to try that. Okay. And of course, there are the New Year's Eve parties. From the website resolutiondenver.com, history of the New Year's Eve, quote, one of the most popular ways to welcome the upcoming year is to make a champagne toast. It originates from Christians' tradition of drinking wine in the Eucharist, symbolizing the blood of Christ. In the Champagne region in France, wine started becoming present during baptisms. Thus, it was slowly being used in any religious gatherings. Ancient people would also raise their glass and drink to health and honor. Now, individuals from different parts of the world would make that toast to ring in the new year. End quote. Of course, the new year on the Gregorian calendar is not any type of holiday sanctioned by God. Not only that, but many don't just drink a simple toast on New Year's Eve. They get plastered, right? Yeah, toasted, plastered, whatever. 1 Peter 4, verse 3. Let's get out of trouble here and go to 1 Peter 4, verse 3, if you would. 1 Peter 4, verse 3. And while we're going there, I'd like to mention this. According to Time magazine, New Year's Eve is one of the most dangerous holidays of the year due to drunk driving and alcohol-related injuries and deaths. Now, I know in the past, before we were in the church, I know that many of us have participated in many traditions like New Year's Eve or New Year's Day that we shouldn't have in the past. But today, we know better. Again, 1 Peter 4, verse 3. I'll be reading this from the Good News Bible. It tells us, you have spent enough time in the past doing what the heathen like to do. Your lives were spent in indecency, lust, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and the disgusting worship of idols. So just as our Bibles tell us, many of us have in the past participated in things that the heathen did. Often we didn't know. Things like indecency, lust, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, or at the very least, the disgusting worship of idols. I think most of us have probably done that in our younger years. Now, when we decided to stop following the traditions of the heathen, what happened to us, among other things? At one point we realized that following the traditions of the heathen is not something God approves of. So today, many of you no longer observe a traditional New Year's celebration, or Christmas or Easter for that matter. But what happens to those who come to reject the ways of the heathen and follow the ways of Christ? What happens when they stop following the heathen and begin worshiping in spirit and in truth? What happens to us? Verse 4. Again, Good News Bible, 1 Peter 4, verse 4. And now the heathen are surprised when you do not join them in the same wild and reckless living, and so they insult you. Ever happened? Hey, why don't you come over to our New Year's Eve party like you used to? Or why don't you observe Christmas and play Santa Claus anymore? What's wrong with you? What's happened? Well, people will find it odd. They'll make fun of us. They'll ridicule us for not continuing to participate in their heathen traditions that honor their false gods. Verse 5. But they will have to give an account of themselves to God, who's ready to judge the living and the dead. At one time we may not have known any better, but as true disciples of Jesus Christ today, now we do. It seems that most of the traditions of New Year's seems to revolve around gaining favor from the gods. I'm having a hard time today. Let's try this again. It seems that most of the traditions of New Year's seem to revolve around gaining favor from the gods by eating certain foods, making certain promises, maybe kissing the right person. But of course, none of these things involve the true source of our blessings, the one true God. Turn next, if you would, to 1 Corinthians as we wind down here. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 11. I'll try to get it out right this time. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 11. Many of us didn't know why we observed many of the traditions of New Year's Day or New Year's Eve in the past. We just followed the crowd, not knowing any better, not knowing what we were doing or why we were even doing it, right? We didn't know. But God has called us into his marvelous light and taught us his truth. He's blessed us with his understanding, with our understanding. And we've learned and we've grown in Jesus Christ. At this point, we're no longer children in the faith. Again, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. With our precious calling and with the aid of the Holy Spirit, we should no longer be as children in the faith. We need to put away all those heathen traditions. Turn next to John 4, if you would, verse 23. It's John 4, verse 23. John 4:23. So, do we continue to eat certain foods on New Year's Day to obtain blessings from a foreign god? In fact, even unclean food that the one true God tells us not to eat. Should we jump off a chair at the very beginning of the new year to bring us good luck? I wouldn't suggest that. Especially not if we're having adult beverages that are present at many of the New Year's Eve parties. Okay, can you imagine that? Drinking too much at a New Year's Eve party, then jumping off a chair? Again, John 4, verse 23. But the hour comes, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. If we want to please our true God, how can we avoid doing things that will displease him? How can we worship him in spirit and in truth? Well, obviously, keeping God's commandments is a good idea. But what about a tradition we may not be really familiar with? How do we avoid accidentally participating in something that our Creator might consider as an abomination to him? Well, the first thing might be to always understand why we're doing something. Why are we doing what we're doing? If we just join the crowd and following a tradition that we don't understand in the first place, why would we just blindly do this anyway? If we truly love God, we never want to do anything that he would consider an abomination. If we really care and our desire to truly express our love to him, we should always ensure that any tradition we practice is not something God detests, that he considers an abomination, such as following the ways of heathen. So to conclude today, God has given us a calendar. He has given us his appointed times, his holy Sabbath days. We use God's calendar to hold our sacred assemblies, to worship him, and also for prophetic understanding. Now, the world has come up with its own calendar. Most of the world today use the Gregorian calendar. And we really have to use a Gregorian calendar to function today in man's world. We don't have a lot of choice. But the first day of the year, like many other of man's holidays, brings with it many pagan beliefs and practices. And we should never just do something because we see someone else do it. Everything we do should be to the glory of God. We should never seek the favor of false gods by observing their traditions, and we should not even give the appearance of evil by doing so. We shouldn't be participating in drunken parties on New Year's Eve. We shouldn't be deliberately eating certain foods to somehow gain favor with those false gods and goddesses, especially unclean foods, like I said. Let's turn to Colossians 2, verse 8 to end today. That's Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. Now, if we truly love our God, we never want to do anything to disappoint Him. We never want to be associated with false gods or their worship. We never want to try to gain their favor by doing something that is intended to please them. As always, we should look to the one true God for guidance and for our blessings. Don't allow others to lead us into the ways of the world and into the traditions of men. Again, Colossians 2, verse 8 to end today. That's what Paul says. He says, "Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ."